Though the East River had been spanned, other chasms remained, which in the years to come would grow ever wider and deeper and prove even more difficult to span. As immigrants in numbers greater than ever before poured into New York, fueling the most dynamic industrial economy on Earth, another migration was underway, of millionaires, as the nation's wealthiest citizens now converged on Manhattan, which had become the mecca of all who sought power and prestige in America. From Pittsburgh came steel magnates Andrew Carnegie and Henry Frick. From Chicago, Philip Armour, who had made a fortune packing meat. From Cleveland, John D. Rockefeller, the oil magnate, well on his way to becoming the richest man in the world.
It was like a magnet for capital and for people who were having ideas that were going to increase capital. You had to talk to your bankers, you had to talk to other people who were doing things, and eventually most of them did have houses in New York as well, even if they kept residence elsewhere. It was the center of the American universe.
The one thing I know after 81 years of life is that the world's divided between insiders and outsiders, and everybody wants to be an insider. And so you come to the city in which there are more opportunities, there are more open doors, there are more ways to become an insider than probably anywhere else on Earth.
By 1890, nearly half the millionaires in America, 1,800 in all, had flocked into the city and its suburbs, bringing with them a scale of extravagance startling even by the standards of New York. Along Fifth Avenue, once lined with somber brownstones, a parade of opulent mansions soon stretched more than 2.5 miles, each more extravagant than the next.
The interminable succession of luxurious mansions proclaims a wild abundance. This avenue has visibly been willed and created by sheer force of millions, which has left not an inch of ground untouched.
It's the place to make it and the place to flaunt it. And in the 19th century, as in the 20th century, the difference between the 1880s and the 1980s is when people flaunted it in the 1880s, they put on a public display. The city became a great, big, beautiful outdoor museum, a kind of urban paradise. That public display was fantastic. The Vanderbilts were not embarrassed to get into their equipages in front of their houses and ride up and down Fifth Avenue. And anybody, if he had just the daring do, the temerity, could stand there and be part of this urban drama.
It is only a matter of 3 miles from Madison Square to Hester Street. But who would dream, who had not seen it, that the same town held within so short a distance scenes and people so contrasted? Harper's Monthly.
Though the gap between them grew wider with each passing year, rich and poor alike were greeted now, as they came into the city, by an astonishing sight, rising like an apparition from the middle of the bay. On the rainy, windswept afternoon of October 28, 1886, the gift the French had been trying to give for more than 20 years was finally unveiled, its pedestal paid for in the end by the nickels and dimes of hundreds of thousands of ordinary New Yorkers.
The promised land flies before us like the mirage. Material progress does not merely fail to relieve poverty. It actually produces it. This association of progress with poverty is the great enigma of our times. It is the riddle which the Sphinx of Fate puts to our civilization, and which not to answer is to be destroyed. Henry George.
5 days after the statue was unveiled, New Yorkers went to the polls. On the ballot was a brilliant social theorist named Henry George, committed as no candidate before him to closing the gap between rich and poor, and running on a platform that called for a land tax, better housing and working conditions, and free public transportation for the poor. Why should there be such abject poverty in this city? George demanded. We are toiling perhaps for Mrs. Astor, or the heirs of some dead Dutchman.
We have to remember that there's been a counter vision of what New York City should be, and it's been emerging out of the working class and immigrant quarters. An odd test moment of this takes place in 1886 when Henry George, a land reformer, runs for the mayoralty of New York City. And he puts together an astonishing coalition of the disaffected and the outcast.
But in the end, Henry George's United Labor Party was no match for Tammany Hall. Frightened by the strength of George's support amongst the immigrant poor who kept it in power, Tammany threw its immense machine behind a moderate Democratic businessman named Abram Hewitt, who attacked George's party as the enemies of civilization and order. On Election Day, he was resoundingly defeated, and the gulf he had hoped to bridge grew wider. One summer afternoon, as the 19th century came to a close, an Irish-American vaudeville singer named Charles Lawler asked his friend James Blake, a salesman in a hat shop, to come up with the lyrics for a tune that had been rattling around in his head for some time. Something about New York, Lawler said. Between serving customers, Blake found himself thinking of the old neighborhood on 18th Street, where he had grown up, and of the people he had known there. Jakey Krause, the baker, and his friend Little Jimmy Crow, and Mamie O'Rourke, who had first taught him how to dance. Set to the lovely lilting two-step Lawler had composed, Blake's haunting memories of the sidewalks of New York would go on to become an enormous hit across the country, and one of the most popular songs ever written about New York City.
East side, west side, all around the town. The tots sang Ring Around Rosie. London Bridge is falling down. Boys and girls together. Me and Mamie O'Rourke tripped the light fantastic on the sidewalks of New York. Things have changed since those times. Some are up in G. Others they are on the hog, but they all felt just like me. They would part with all they've got. Could they but once more walk with their best girl and have a twirl on the sidewalks of New York?
Though few people knew it, the heartbreaking tune marked the end of an era in the city's history, and the beginning of another. In the years to come, the Irish and German immigrants whose experience it commemorated would begin to move on, even as a new and far larger influx of peoples began to overtake the old, transforming forever the sidewalks of New York.
Walt Whitman said, "I chant the divine average." Whitman wrote so movingly about talking about the immigrants. I sing of the immigrants 15 to 20,000 a day pouring ashore. And of course, Whitman's vision was of a democratic society transforming their lives, bringing them together and transforming it. But the fact is that in the Gilded Age, in my opinion, Whitman's optimism wasn't happening. what was happening was what Lincoln Steffens and Jacob Riis wrote about. New York was the New York of child labor and the sweatshops. I mean, we don't even think of what child labor was. It was little children working next to their mothers 6 and sometimes 7 days a week in rooms in which there were no windows because the factory owners didn't want them distracted, working all the days of their youth away.
In October 1890, a curious volume went on sale in the bookstores of New York. Called How the Other Half Lives, it had been written by a 41-year-old Danish-born police reporter named Jacob Riis. It would change forever the way people thought about the city. Riis had come to New York in 1870, when he was just 21, with $40 in his pocket. The money soon ran out, and he had learned firsthand what immigrant life could be like in the sprawling metropolis. Homeless, often hungry, and out of work, he had drifted into the crime-infested world of the 5 Points slum, dozing on the cold, filthy floors of police lodging houses. More than once, he considered killing himself. Eventually, he landed on his feet and managed to find work as a police reporter for the New York Tribune, and spent the next 10 years exploring the densely crowded slums of the Lower East Side. The sights, he later said, gripped my heart until I felt that I must tell of them or burst. Determined to show the world what he had seen, Riis began publishing magazine articles, but they seemed to make no impression, he wrote. He thought of taking pictures, but the tenements were too dark for the photographs to come out. Then, in 1887, a breakthrough came with the invention of a new photographic device, a magnesium flash powder that flooded even the deepest shadow with a brilliant flash of light. Armed with the new apparatus, Riis and his assistants plunged into the 5 Points.
With their way illuminated by spasmodic flashes, as bright and brief as those of lightning itself, a mysterious party has lately been startling the town. Denizens of the dives, tramps and bumpers,